We live in a complicated world. We live complicated lives within a complicated human landscape. Our complicated lives are made more complicated by the complicated biological, ecological, zoological, psychological, socioeconomical, political, technological, and cosmological realities that we interact with every day. Now, interact may be too kind a word to use in many of these cases. Too often, we don't really interact, but are more likely to react to these overwhelming realities that surround us and often dominate us. For complicated people like us, reacting is often the least complicated thing we'll ever do. I'm not saying that simply reacting makes us simple, because I know, and you know, that we are simply not simple. Not simple, except perhaps for the simple conclusion that we often reach as we react to overwhelming reality. That complicated equals chaos. Now, I should probably explain that. By definition, chaos makes no sense. So we are persuaded, even conditioned, to believe that our inability to make sense of these massive, complicated realities renders the whole hot mess an expression of massive chaos. And of course, if it is chaos, it's probably also massively random as well. Now, the most recent and fashionable new meme for this chaos is called the Law of Unintended Consequences. Feels kind of ironic that they call it a law, doesn't it? I mean, does it really seem sensible, beyond our desire to appear intellectual, philosophical, or even spiritual, that the gentle beating of a butterfly's wings in Brazil can set off a catastrophic tornado in Texas? Now that feels like an unintended consequence, which can only be verified if you were able to ask a butterfly about its intention. Now, some of you may remember that this famous question was asked by an American mathematician, Edward Lorenz, in 1963. We did a presentation on this at the question community in October of last year. Now, Lorenz asked this question in 1963, and it connected the zoological reality of a butterfly with the meteorological reality of a tornado. Now, that question spawned a whole new theory of connection, a new scientific model of chaos. This is actually an animation of Lorenz's model of the butterfly effect. This is actually why they call it the butterfly effect. It's a computer modeling of an equation that maps out a storm. Now, the butterfly effect is just one of those discussions about connected reality that we can choose to either interact with or react to. Now, the cold truth about most of these discussions is that the interaction option often leads us to that complication equals chaos neverland that I just spoke of. And our noble motivation to interact soon diminishes to reaction and protective apathy. A single big question of connected reality, like this one, dropped like an elevator music bomb into our quite natural self-absorption, might momentarily distract us or even prompt a fleeting interest. But most often, it will tranquilize us into choosing the easier, less complicated option. Reaction. Even if part of us wants to interact and explore the possibility that the butterfly is somehow connected to the tornado, we are overwhelmed and often discouraged by the next thought that inevitably follows. That if we pursue the big questions of connected reality, will we find out that the complicated chase will lead us into some kind of a bottomless and possibly worthless rabbit hole? So our head explodes. And we don't like that so much generally. And so we react with an observer's indifference to the question. Now, the debate over climate change is another example of the problem we face with connected reality. Talk about head exploding. It's a problem of multiple connected realities. biological, industrial, ecological, political, and cosmological. I could go on and on. But beyond acknowledging that climate change is a problem, the sheer scope of its connections and the debate about each connection discourages many of us from interacting in a meaningful way with the problem. And so each year, because of that, the temperature of the planet increases. Now, this is a good example of how our reaction to the complexity of climate change may actually be the real chaos. But what about those connected realities that don't seem quite so epic on the surface? Like how that great deal you got on a pair of jeans at the local H&M is connected to a factory building collapse in Bangladesh that kills hundreds of faceless, impoverished workers who you'll never know personally. We are forced to recognize that the probable number of connected realities in our lives is staggering. Perhaps too staggering to further consider, explore, and, Lord have mercy, interact with. So we react to a kind of default view of reality, seen through the lens of chaos and randomness. Now, there's no shame in saying that this default view is just easier on our already pressurized, explosion-prone heads. Now, staying with the lens metaphor, it's kind of like the one-size-fits-all reading glass kiosk at Walmart. Okay? Different styles for everybody, but no prescription required. Viewing our world through a reactive lens allows us to avoid looking for connections inside the complexity. We don't have to interact if we don't acknowledge a connection. And so complexity has become the new chaos. Randomness has become the new reality. And it's also our new safe zone. But tonight, I'm going to push back a bit against the message that our lives are just too complicated to go beyond just reacting. I want to push back against our reluctance to interact with a too complicated world or a too complicated universe. I want to raise up some skepticism about the notion that overwhelming complexity is the new message of chaos. I want to raise up some questions about connected realities. And I want to raise up another question about another message. The message of symmetry. Now, the message of symmetry is like an unexpected, irritating debate opponent to the message of chaos. As I said before, without wanting to be critical, we often avoid the trauma of our connected realities by defaulting to the message of chaos. Now, the message of chaos is not just about simple asymmetry, which is the antonym of symmetry. Asymmetry is not chaos. The message of chaos is about disorder, confusion, unpredictability, randomness, and formlessness, if the dictionary is to be believed. We don't have to interact with the message of chaos because there's nothing about chaos that's constant enough, consistent enough, or manageable enough to interact with. Let me explain what I mean. The unprecedented wonder of our age is the overwhelming flow of information, images, and experiences literally at our fingertips. Now, last September, in a presentation about the cloud, I described this overwhelming flow. A couple of examples. Every 2 days, we generate as much data as we did from the dawn of civilization to the year 2003. 90% of all data ever produced was generated just in the last 2 years. That's how incredible and overwhelming this flow of information is now. There is so much information flowing to us and around us that it's like falling into the raging rapids of a wild river. We have no way of anchoring, no way of interacting with the flow. We are mostly just able to react to the flow with the hope that we can survive it, or even eventually ignore it. We realize that we can no longer claim to be in control of it. Perhaps that's why we come to believe that complexity is chaos, because we can't control complexity. The message of chaos is that our lives and our world are ultimately out of control. even after we have really tried and then failed to control them. Science and technology, social engineering, and even warfare represent our attempts to interact with our connected realities and control the participants, the process, and the outcome. Now, the connected realities of bogus intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, leading to the US invasion of Iraq, leading to the birth of ISIS, leading to a new era of international terrorism and mass refugee migration, is just one simplistically stated example of our failure to bring order to disorder, our failure to control chaos in our world. This is the law of unintended consequences at work. We are profoundly struck by the astonishing complexity of just one connected geopolitical reality like this. So our heads explode. Again, instead of diminishing chaos, our well-intentioned interactions often increase chaos in ways that we could never have conceived. Our noble intentions seem to breed more chaos into a world of chaos. So we react to the chaos by diminishing or even abandoning our search for order, for meaning, even for truth. Because we see proof, real-world proof, that chaos may be the only real truth that there is. That proof seems so overwhelming sometimes that we have adapted. We've actually adapted to this, and we found a way to be okay with understanding complexity as chaos. Even our universe is thought to have been conceived and flung outward to infinity from the very first expression of chaos, the Big Bang. The Big Bang is the ultimate scientific message of chaos. But is there another message out there? Now, what is symmetry? I found symmetry to be one of those words whose definition leads to a question about meaning. Like when we encounter words like democracy or love. We covered the meaning of love actually last May at another presentation. But for now, let's stick to the definition. That's pretty interesting itself. Now, symmetry is from the Greek word symmetria, which basically means agreement in dimensions, proportion, and arrangement. Sounds about right, doesn't it? Things that strike us as being symmetrical definitely seem to fit this criteria. We kind of assume that measuring the dimensions, proportion, and arrangement of something will determine if it's symmetrical or not. But in practice, the ancient Greeks viewed the meaning of symmetria in an expanded form, beyond mere mathematical measurements. 4th century Greek sculptor Polykleitos developed a revolutionary theory about the relationship between the mathematical expression and the dimensions of symmetry and the dynamic movements of the human body. His sculptures of young Greek athletes were studies of the interplay of detail and dimension with balance and rhythm. He called this interplay symmetria. Now, the concept of symmetria changed artistic perspective forever, paved the way for the sublime works of Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Rodin, and countless others. So from the very beginning, symmetry was not just a calculation. Symmetria was, as the definition says, an agreement. Symmetria was relationship. In our modern and highly calculated technological age, where we seek to measure everything, we might do well to remember that symmetria is not just a number. This may be more important than you think. Okay, so first, a quick tutorial. Our modern definition of symmetry is something like this composite description taken from several dictionaries and sources. The symmetry is similarity or exact correspondence between different things. So an example would be, history sometimes exhibits strange symmetries between different events. Symmetry is exactly similar parts facing each other or around an axis. So an example would be, this figure has a line of symmetry through its center. Symmetry is harmonious arrangement, beautiful proportion and balance. That's the Greek concept of symmetria. Symmetry can be a mathematical or a geometric form that determines a one-to-one mapping onto itself. Now, I don't know, has anyone ever heard of a Fibonacci sequence? Some of you have, right? Okay. I've got an example of a Fibonacci sequence there. It's a sequence of numbers. Now, in nature and the cosmos, Fibonacci is an amazing recurring number system embedded in composition. For example, it governs both the number and arrangement of flower petals or leaves in plants. It's embedded in geometric structure. For example, it governs the evolution of spiral symmetry in seashells or ram's horns. Now, even though Fibonacci is intimately connected with symmetry, the subject actually became too big and too fascinating to attempt to cover tonight. I actually started writing about it and then decided I better stop because it was going to be about a 2-hour presentation. So perhaps we'll get a chance to deal with this in the future. So back to the definition. Symmetry is also invariance. I'll explain this a little bit later. Invariance despite various translations or positions. The way to understand this is to think about the array of cells inside a honeycomb. That's a form of invariant symmetry. Now, the first clue to the power of a message is how narrow a stream it cuts in our consciousness, and then how easily it's overshadowed by other messages. Every message carries the same question. Is it just a lonely, isolated stream, or is it a tributary to a great river? The message of symmetry had prompted such a question for me. Is symmetry a single form or a multi-form? Are there different kinds of symmetry? Okay, first a bit of a spoiler alert. I'm going to concentrate tonight on basic visual symmetry. Now, the reason I say this is that the world of symmetry extends into all scientific realms and even into the spiritual realm. Physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics all have concepts of symmetry deeply embedded in their principles and practice. The iconic Taoist concept of yin and yang is a centuries-old cornerstone expression of spiritual symmetry. So, because I couldn't possibly understand or effectively share all of these potential tributaries to that great river I spoke about, we'll have to settle for the more obvious visual door to the message of symmetry. I'm hoping that that will be enough to provoke a question for you. Reflectional symmetry is also called bilateral symmetry or line symmetry or mirror symmetry. It occurs when a line is drawn to divide a shape in halves so that each half is a reflection of the other. Okay, it's reflected in a lot of humans and animals and a lot of architecture. This is the ancient heritage of symmetria in our civilization. It's so omnipresent in our surroundings that we're kind of desensitized to its presence in our lives. Bilateral symmetry drives our concepts of beauty in humans, animals, and objects alike. If beauty can literally be measured, it's through measures of symmetry. Whether we're judging bodybuilders, movie stars, beauty queens, dogs, or horses, bilateral symmetry is quintessential to our personal ideals of form. It's kind of how we know normal on the physical plane. Radial symmetry occurs when radiating parts are regularly arranged around a central axis. A vertical cut through the axis on any angle produces two halves that are mirror images of each other. The wonder of radial symmetry is that whether it's a kiwi fruit or a snowflake, the expression of symmetry is both completely programmed, that's the inorganic option, and also completely individual, the organic option. Now, almost every snowflake is both symmetrical and individual at the same time. I was actually driving here today, and there were snowflakes falling on my windshield, and I was just marveling because I could actually see the individual snowflakes resting on my windshield before they melted, and it was incredible to see how individual and intricate they are. Almost every snowflake is both symmetrical and individual at the same time. Now, it's symmetrical because of the intrinsic electrostatic properties that bind water molecules around a nucleus. Okay? Individual because of the specific microclimate conditions that surround each snowflake as it freezes and forms. And it's that microclimate that creates the individuality. Radial symmetry provokes its own question about how a programmed scientific form becomes a personal, even artistic expression. Translational symmetry occurs when a figure or focal point undergoes a movement, a shift or a slide in a specified direction or vector. By the way, for those of you who are wondering, that's a kind of broccoli on the far left of the slide. The expression of translational symmetry is constant throughout the movement or direction. The only thing that changes is its location. Translational symmetry doesn't automatically feel like symmetry because it's multi-directional. In fact, translational symmetry can seem a bit like chaos. It is arguably the most intriguing kind of visual symmetry because it could be a simultaneous expression of reflectional, radial, and spiral symmetry, depending on your perspective. Honeycombs and the works of M.C. Escher are beautiful examples of translational symmetry. Translational symmetry allows us to interact with simplicity embedded inside complexity. Translational symmetry may demonstrate that complexity is not chaos. Spiral symmetry is best expressed in three-dimensional space. It's best observed when rotating an object at a constant angular speed around its axis, while simultaneously translating the object at a constant linear speed along its axis. Spiral symmetry can be simultaneous in its horizontal, vertical, and rotational perspective. Now, this explanation I know sounds a little bit geeky. Sorry about that. But if I mentioned a barber pole to you, not sure if there are any more barber poles out there, would you relate to spiral symmetry? If I mentioned a drill bit, would that register? How about DNA? How about the EM field generated by the human heart? How about a cosmic wormhole? All of these are examples of spiral symmetry. The questions about this kind of symmetry may never end. This is because spiral symmetry is the most mysterious of symmetries present in our world and in the greater universe. It's not only a symmetry in the present, but as it moves and it changes, it is constantly becoming itself again. Spiral symmetry is a kind of renewable or sustainable symmetry. Beauty and harmony of form were basic characteristics of ancient Greek symmetria. But to the ancient Greeks as well, beauty and harmony of movement elevated symmetria to the sublime expression of symmetry. Some of the newest discoveries of spiral symmetry seem to touch that sublime dimension. These are actual photographs. This is an actual photograph of Hurricane Katrina. And on the right, that's an actual photograph taken from Hubble. I hope I've been able to make at least a case for the faint message of symmetry in our lives. In the midst of the chaos and randomness that seem to characterize both our inner and outer worlds, symmetry can be found literally everywhere that chaos is present. Think about that for a moment. From the tiniest strand of DNA to the gigantic event horizon of a cosmic wormhole, symmetry permeates our uncontrollable, random, chaotic existence. Now, in other community gatherings, we presented and discussed the tension between coincidence and synchronicity. I have to get synchronicity into every presentation. Some of you are probably still exploring that question. And just as we posed that question of whether synchronicity is just the exception or the alternative to coincidence, tonight we're posing a similar question. Is symmetry just the exception, or is it the alternative to chaos? Now, if you've allowed yourself to enter into the debate tonight between the message of chaos and the message of symmetry, you may now be concerned about your head exploding. Which, if you remember, I said is the usual warning sign that your interaction is about to end in favor of reaction, perhaps nuclear. Now, you'll recognize this warning sign when you find yourself thinking that we've just complicated the question more by claiming there's a debate at all, or even that there's a message of any kind. So before your head explodes, it's perfectly okay to push back when someone like me is thrusting an uncomfortable debate in your face. Now, I said at the beginning that I was pushing back on the message of chaos. On the other hand, I also said earlier with conviction that if one chooses the complexity is chaos option, it does not have to be defended. Just like the Areopagus in ancient Athens, this community respects all of the options that you might choose for any question, including the option of too complicated to choose. This community only wants to be all about the questions. The options of the answers should be all about you. I present the message of symmetry tonight not so much to debate with the message of chaos, but more to provoke some questions about the differences between the messages. For example, even as symmetry and chaos coexist all around us, is it possible that one state is an origin and one state is a result? Even if the universe originated from the ultimate chaos of the Big Bang, why was so much symmetry the result? By the way, this is a real picture of Saturn. This is taken by the Cassini space probe. It arrived there. It's an international effort of, I think, about 50 countries. It arrived at Saturn in 2008. It is still there, taking pictures and sending back data. This is a real picture of Saturn. Another question. So alternatively, if symmetry is the natural origin of all things, why is chaos so often the result? You can ask the question either way, with one or the other being the origin and the result. How does it affect you when you see identical principles of symmetry expressed in strands of DNA and cosmic wormholes, or spider webs and snowflakes? Do the expressions of symmetry that are shared between living and non-living things represent a relationship or reflection of some kind? What kind of relationship binds the living and non-living in expressions of symmetry? What is being reflected in these expressions of symmetry throughout the universe? Now, are we witnessing principle? Are we witnessing a law? Are we witnessing art? Now, there is a strong message of chaos all around us, no doubt. But tonight I've shared another possible message with you, the message of symmetry. Remember that I said that the power of a message is measured by how narrow a stream it cuts into our consciousness, and then how easily it's overshadowed by other messages? Every message carries the same question. Is it just a lonely, isolated stream, or is it a tributary of a great river? If we listen to the message of symmetry, do we just hear a gentle trickling nearby, or do we hear a great roar of waters in the distance? And if symmetry is a message, what is a message? That's the end of the presentation. Thanks very much.